Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. One of Emergent Order's earliest clients is an organization called State Policy Network, which focuses on supporting basically research organizations based in the states all around the country, state-based think tanks. One of the people that was most enthusiastic about the creative work we were doing and who I've come to really love and respect is Lynn Harsh. She has a long history of working in this state-based think tank movement, including founding an organization in Washington State and now working with the State Policy Network to try to advance classical liberal principles through public policy at the state level. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with my good friend, Lynn Harsh. So one of the first people I met when I began to explore this world of classical liberal and free market oriented organizations was Daniel Ersbaumer at SPN. And it wasn't soon after that I got to meet one of my favorite people in this universe, who is joining me now, Lynn Harsh. So Lynn, thanks for coming to have this conversation with me.
No, John, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for talking.
One of the reasons why I was excited to have a conversation with you, Lynn, is that you bring a really interesting perspective to this world that is often, I think, sort of simplistically called right of center. And I just want to get into your background and like hear your story, because I think, you've come at this universe not from the world of engineering or sort of DC politics or a lot of the sort of I don't know, the typical roads that these folks that we work with a lot have come through. So tell me about, like, let's start at the very beginning. Like, where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Spokane, Washington, reared mostly in Oregon by parents who have remarkably different political and personal views than I do now, but they were adventurous folk who I guess if free-range parenting had been a thing then, that's what you'd have called them. So reared in both city and country, to work hard, study hard, love ideas, challenge ideas, and love the outdoors. So a very untraditional background, actually, which I deeply appreciate now at this point in my life.
Yeah, talk to me more about the culture of, that you grew up in a part of the country that is so strikingly beautiful naturally that it's hard not to become a sort of enraptured by it. I mean, whether it's Northern California, Oregon, Washington, they all they like change you when you're there.
Yes.
And I say this as a Northeasterner. Obviously, there's beauty all around the country, but there's something special about the Northwest.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm looking at my window right now at 8 snow-capped mountain peaks. They stir me deeply, and I celebrate the first snow of every year by having breakfast outside with my family and friends and in our warm robes. And it's just, there's something about this land that has always spoken deeply to me. But, our settling here in Washington, Oregon, and parts of California, a lot of rebels, a lot of people running from the law who came here. One of my relatives was one of the worst possible territorial governors one could possibly imagine having. And I look back on the decades, the generations that came before, and we have a mixed history here. But it is a beautiful part of the world. And for me, I require these mountains and this land. So I do love it. And so we were reared outdoors like this. My parents were teachers, but not typical teachers, and we certainly didn't have a typical family home. Lived in trailer houses and a garage my dad built and 60 acres of land that we got to roam. And then my parents divorced when I was young, and so then I became the head of the household, as it were. And it was my sister-in-law calls it benign neglect, but I will tell you that all four of us who are very close now had adventures that few kids have today. And while I didn't choose all of that for my children, I did modify my parenting based something on this. We had grand adventures. We read. We didn't have television. We read books. I think I look back on pictures and I think, wow, somebody should have helped us figure out how to dress better and all that. But I'll tell you, as grown-ups, we all have really great lives, marvelous families, and careers that we've thoroughly enjoyed, and we all love to learn. We're all incredibly curious, and that's a gift our parents gave us. So, yeah, there were some things we didn't get, but honestly, we got some things that are sorely missing today. Under no circumstances would we have spoken uncivilly to someone else, whether we agreed with them or disagreed with them. Under no circumstances would my parents have ever permitted us to have taken property from someone or to be rude to someone older or wiser. So someday I'd like to write about that time in life, and it's not with the tell-all terrible things. That some things did happen that shouldn't have, but honestly, for the most part, we got a gift, and I treasure it.
What was your first inkling of a career path or a passion that could propel you into your adult life? Where did that start to happen?
Yeah. Well, when I was in fifth grade, I learned I would never be coordinated enough to be a ballerina, and now I realize that would have been a terrible choice. And that was the same year I also discovered I would never like math and science enough to go into space, even though I wanted to in the worst kind of way. I played competitive fast-pitch softball, and it was playing second base and shortstop that my father, who had been a pro ball player in a part of his life, taught me about strategy. And I didn't understand it then. Again, it's a gift. And so somewhere early in my life, I realized that that my nature was to look down the road and around the corner and to try to figure out leverage. But my scholarship was in music, and I was a vocalist, and I could not figure out how to make that work. And so all of those things growing up about being a little competitive and trying to figure out leverage, I just couldn't figure out how to make that work. And so I did a default thing, really. And I went to college to learn to be a teacher. My parents were teachers. It only took me about 6 years to realize this is not my career path. I admire good teachers. I admire good teachers so much. But the structure in which good teachers have to function, I thought, bred some poor teaching and drove out the best teachers. And so the structure itself was. So then I thought, well, how does this education thing happen? Where are these policies made? And I realized after talking to some folks that they're made in state capitals and the U.S. Capitol. And so I thought, well, okay, then I'll figure out how that works. And so I started a career of helping to try to elect people who understood that local governance was the way to go. And it was during that time that I really started to understand what markets were. Even though I'd studied economics in college, I had never been introduced to Hayek, only Keynes and Galbraith. I really began to understand about human freedom and both its benefits and responsibilities, and all that started to come together for me. And I realized I love policy. I like helping people figure out how to do stuff in life. So bottom line, John, it's just kind of been an interesting career, and I hope that a contribution that I will make with my family is to love the world of ideas and freedom, and that that I will find many fine leaders throughout the country that I can bring into this circle to help us get better and better. I love the whole leadership arena.
So
wander around a little bit too much there. I'm sorry.
Well, you gave a great flyover that I'm now going to chop apart piece by piece.
All right.
So I was struck by something, which is you were born in Spokane, Washington, studied music, but ended up in the world of public policy. It sounds a whole lot like the story of Arthur Brooks. So,
Well, it's so interesting because I had the pleasure of introducing him at a function, and he plays an instrument beautifully. And I thought, well, I guess you're right. It's the world of ideas and freedom and beauty and the things that freedom creates. It's an honor to be compared to someone like Arthur Brooks. But yeah, interesting background.
So for those listening that don't know Arthur, he's soon to be the former president of the American Enterprise Institute, and he's the subject of our feature film, The Pursuit, which is coming out in August on Netflix. But I want to come back to your time as a teacher. So you said you spent 6 years in teaching?
I did,
So,
and I became a principal for a little while. Yeah.
so what was, when you first started, what did you think it meant to be a teacher? Take yourself back to that beginning point where you've gotten out of school. Did you study education, or what was how did your major lead you towards teaching?
Well, secondary education. I'm ill-suited for those beautiful children who come to school at 6 and 7 and can't tie their own shoes or blow their own nose. And though I adore them, I can't teach them. So I chose high school. I really thought that we would be entering a world where we could discuss ideas, learn the grammar of a subject matter, the basics, the fundamentals, the boot camp, if you will, of a subject matter, and then use that to springboard into larger discussions. My father had been a teacher like that, and I don't think he would be able to teach in most schools today. And even though he and I don't have the same philosophy about life and freedom and education, I admired the way he taught. I was finishing up my education when I was struck by how angry I was at one point. And I'm not an angry person generally. So
No.
and I became, well, what is this anger? And it was realizing that I was surrounded by a group of people, some of whom were just like me. They wanted to get into this world of ideas and shape the future, help shape a future for a human being, somebody who could choose opportunity. And there were others who I'm not sure, I don't even know how they got to college. And I don't think you have to be college educated to be a great teacher, by the way, but there was just no intellectual spark there. And I realized nobody here really knows if I know anything about my subject matter. Nobody cares. And I'm about to go into a system where they're going to reward me for how many years my rear end is in a seat instead of what happens with my students. And so I started poorly from the fact that I realized I may have made a mistake.
So it's interesting. You have a perspective on this subject that's informed by a lot of work that's happened since. But I want to ask you to try to go back to that moment of frustration and see if you can strip away your knowledge base of the education system as it exists and all the incentives, and we'll come back to that. Because I think there's something, I've heard this story from several teachers over the years, of coming in with an excitement for learning and hitting a kind of process or bureaucratic wall. Some of it's about the curriculums and how they're tied to standardized testing. Some of it's about the culture of the school. But when you talk about not being able to teach in the way that you saw your father teaching, what was standing in the way of that? What practically was causing that frustration on even like I'd say like a daily level?
We protect the structure. I saw that quickly. We protect a system and a structure. We protect people who've been there a long time. We protect safety. so that nobody teaches anything that might be controversial or that might upset some parent. We actually have to teach to the middle. It's the only way to survive.
What does that mean?
Those
Teach to the middle.
There's not, because we group kids in classrooms based on how old they are, it quickly became apparent to me that I had kids in my room who, I mean, they really could not even write a complete sentence. And I had kids in my room who were ready for a Socratic discussion. And I had to reach them both. And there was a contract obligations forbid you from staying after school a certain number of hours. And I mean, you're supposed to have an extended contract, a supplemental contract, if you're going to teach beyond a certain number of hours. So some entity besides, it's just like in medicine for me, there's something in the way of the student who needs the education and the teacher, regardless of where they come from or their prep. There are a bunch of things in the middle, in between the student who needs to learn and many times wants to learn, and the person who wants to make sure that happens. And sometimes it's the union, sometimes it's the actual structure of the building itself, the fact that we protect an institution more than we do the kids. And so, I mean, early on, that just hit me really hard. And I realized that my own education, that I had seen that in my own education, but that because I went to a big university town high school where diverse thinking and divergent brain patterns were not disregarded, I got by with it. Because I kind of reared myself and I was on my own at that point in high school, I got by with it. But my kids sitting in my class weren't getting by with it.
When I was,
broke my heart.
It is heartbreaking. It's funny because it's a kind of setup that if you're very self-motivated, it almost doesn't matter what system, right? Like you were saying, I mean, for me, and I went to Catholic school, but in a lot of ways, Catholic school sort of mirrors public school structurally. And there was just, there were the handful of teachers and subjects that I liked. And then there was a bunch of stuff that was just boring and sort of sucked. And I just sort of grinned and bared it and maybe did good, maybe did bad. And then there was this like rich extracurricular world, which for me was art and then later video and computers. And that became almost like more important and more determinative for my future than most of the curriculum in school. But, you have the social context, you have your friends, you have the habit, you have the Friday night football games. And so you're just sort of along for the ride as a student, and you don't know that it's even conceivable that, oh, maybe I don't need to be wasting as much of my week on things that either are just rote or I'm not going to remember even next semester. You're not equipped as a kid to do that, but you do feel viscerally as a kid when something seems like irrelevant or boring or not sort of stimulating. And I've never been a teacher, but I consider myself to be sort of in that universe of wanting to educate others, and the way I do that is really mainly trying to educate myself. Like, how can I learn a subject enough to maybe try to translate it into some sort of video or film or product, and it's fun to learn. But
yes,
what like how do you think about what learning is? Because I don't think there's an easy answer.
Well, first of all, we're born curious. And I will encourage any parent listening out there to just fertilize that curiosity for your child forever. When we're born curious and we're not punished for being curious, obviously there's safety issues, but when we're not punished for having mental curiosity and when we're asking questions about the world, learning is a lot more fun. And you can connect the dots. But John, you've always amazed me because you are a very intelligent person. The content of your video material is rich and deep. You understand the texture of these subjects. How did that happen for you? I mean, you went to Catholic school, you went to, I think, Penn State, was it?
Yeah,
I think,
I
if I
went to
remember
Penn
correctly.
State.
And I mean, where did this rich heritage of knowledge and understanding of how parts connect, where did that come for you?
Well, that's really nice of you to say. I I talk about this a lot with Russ Roberts, who's sort of my other dad,
Yeah.
economist, and
Mm-hmm.
but my dad, my real dad, I'm a junior, so I'm his namesake. Or is he my namesake? I forget how that works. But
In Italian families, I don't know, it doesn't
no,
matter.
right. I mean, I always, as a little side note, I was always kind of bummed because my dad, for whatever, is John Stephen Papola, or really the right way to say it is Papola, but nobody, not even my family says that. And I'm John Stephen Papola Jr. We did not name my son the third because I never liked my middle name. Stephen is the PH. It's not really much of an Italian middle name. So his middle name is Matteo, and we actually use that as his first name.
Mm-hmm.
But my cousin, they hit it out of the park. Gino Gaetano Papola the fourth.
Oh no.
So as far as Italian family naming goes, my cousin is taking the crown for the most Italian name combo ever, and to be the fourth on top of it is just. And I think his son is the fifth. So, but
Did you grow up thinking that's like a weight, or is that like a crown that you wear
oh, it's
proudly?
for me, it's a crown. So my dad is he's a surgeon. He's a systems type of thinker. But he's also an incredibly physically practical man. Before I was 10, I had already like laid tile and done demolition work with
Yes.
my dad.
Yeah.
He grew up, oh man, his upbringing is the stuff of the kind of movies that don't tend to get made anymore. Of basically being put to work as a kid and as a result having to learn physical skills that I do worry are kind of
Yeah.
lost and getting lost. And you see that manifest in a lot of ways, whether it's the average age of a plumber or electrician or the amount of truck driving jobs that are still vacant even now. But so on one hand, I had this I had this mix in my dad of somebody who was incredibly physically practical. Like something breaks, you fix it. And so that creates this and I took to that. I think it was obviously in my nature to take to it. I loved to take things apart. Growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, and so when the other kids got an Atari, I like made an Atari out of paper somehow and used
Oh.
so I made the box, and then I made a little TV out of paper, and then I used McDonald straws to create like a joystick that then went over to the fake paper screen and moved the
Oh
thing when
man.
you moved the straw. So I had a kind of three-dimensionality to my creativity, I guess. And then my mom was an art teacher. And her father, who's like really my grandfather on my mom's side in particular, was just, we were very close. Like the trio was me and my dad and my grandfather, my Bill Fadulo. And he was like a Renaissance man. He didn't go to college, yet he was basically an architect. He built several homes, like designed and built them.
Mm-hmm.
He was a pilot. He was an incredible self-taught painter and artist. I can't talk about him without like getting on the verge of tears, so I'm gonna have to stop because it'll. I'm also, as an Italian man, I'm super blubbery and I'm quick to cry.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So I had this weird mix of genes and influences that were left brain, right brain, always working together, always in a feedback loop. And I think that set me up. I mean, so like when I went to apply for colleges, I applied to engineering and film schools at the same time.
Oh,
And I didn't
interesting.
go to NYU because I wanted to start at a place that had good engineering. So that to me is the soup of why I jump into these abstract economics subjects and then quickly make it into something goofy and fun. Is
Uh-huh.
is I don't it's a weird quirk of I think how I was raised and who I am. But the older I get and the more time I spend, the deeper I want to go. I think I might be a natural academic. Like I like to go a couple layers too deep into the subject.
Mm-hmm. And see, I like to know and hang around with people like you, because I get to about layer two, and then it's like, okay, I'm bored.
Well, there's something good about that too, though, because you don't have to go too many layers deep to get into a world that's really only academic for its own sake, right?
Well, that's right. Well, Shopcraft is Soulcraft. I don't know if you've read that book. Matthew Crawford's the author, and he's a brilliant guy who talks about what we're losing in this country of ours because we now have generations of people who don't think about how to fix something. I'm paraphrasing him horribly here, but who don't actually think holistically about, all right, something broke, it needs to be fixed. Okay, so rational ignorance tells us that we can pick up the phone and call somebody to fix it because most of the time we're not going to know all the ways to do it. But in the way you were reared, and certainly the way I was reared as well, you at least have to stop for a moment and think, this is something that's important. It needs to get fixed. How do I do it? And there's this sense of ownership and pride that comes with accomplishing things. And to this day, I build things for that reason. First of all, I can start and finish them. And my other work is never really done, so I like to start and finish. So I'm always building something, and there are problems that pop up all the time. And some of them I have to call somebody and get some help. But the mental process of thinking something through with the end in mind, this is the end in mind. How are we going to get there? There's something really special about that. And knowing how to do something with your hands, put your head and your hands together, that's very powerful.
It's funny. I'm working on a project that has me reading Marx, and one of the things about Marx is such an interesting character because in a way I think his most interesting thought or contribution, if you will, is this concept of alienation and this idea that, like you just said, humans are kind of naturally builders, and it is a kind of part of our nature. And so specialization that sort of takes you away from getting to start and finish a project and hold the product of it in your hands, in a sense feels like it deprives you of something that's very human. And and of course, the challenge back to that is, well, that's maybe generally true, but it's not true for everybody. Not everybody. A lot of people
That's
don't
right. Sure.
enjoy opening up the dryer to try to find that part that if you get it replaced for $15, it'll start working again instead of having it repaired for $500. But the process is just frustrating and scary, and they don't like to do it, and they don't. Maybe there's a hand-eye coordination thing, or there's just a level of frustration with it, and it's not enjoyable at all. And all they want to read a book, they want to do something else, but that kind of physical work isn't in their wheelhouse. I mean, Arthur made a joke that I could have taken the wrong way, but I took it kind of as a compliment. We were talking once, and I said, there's only a couple things that get me to quiet my mind, and one of them is, kind of strenuous physical labor, just like getting out and moving a pile from one place to another or clearing out a garage. And he's like, oh, that's the old Italian dock worker in you.
Oh, that's great.
And I was like, damn right it is.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so far be it from me to say that all people need to build something or fix the dryer or move a pile. It's just that we do all humans have some creative need. And I have a good friend. First of all, I'm not mechanical at all. So I have a good friend who is, and he doesn't know how to build, but he knows how to fix things that have parts. And I know how to build. I don't know how to fix things that have very many parts. And it's really fun. And then my very best friend, who now lives in Central America, doesn't like doing any of that, but she paints. And so
Right.
we just all have this need inside of us to create something and to see something from it beginning to the end and to solve problems. And you see this in our children all the time. And we have robbed many of them from being able to solve problems, to even seeing where they might need some help. Well, I can do this, but I can't do that. Let's get some help. And so, yeah. So,
It is this thing, I think, that you had the benefit of that growing up in that sort of Western open expanse environment where you were free to do that
mm,
and feel safe with it. Obviously, if you've grown up in Newark, New Jersey, it's not the same.
yeah.
It's not the same environment. It's not. You don't have the same opportunities. But even for people who could have those opportunities, it does. There's something. Something is changing, and it's I think it's a technological process and it's like a wealth process. I feel like that we have these incredible gadgets, and there's a kind of overall push in society as a whole towards abstract work. I feel like it's
Hmm.
part. When we were
Yes.
making At the Fork, I got to spend a full day with Temple Grandin, who
Hmm.
is just this remarkable woman who has fairly severe autism, and yet she is a college professor, and she revolutionized animal husbandry. There's a Claire Danes HBO movie about her life, but one of the
Hmm.
things as we were driving around that she said was, kids today, all they have is abstract knowledge. There's no practical knowledge. And again, like it's like a kind of old person thing, the kids today, and making sweeping generalizations. But I do think this shift towards a focus on abstraction is I don't know what to make of it. I don't know that there's anything that we can do about it per se. I mean, at the individual level, I think there is, but the macro story is way more complicated. Like, how do you think about that?
Yes, I'm really excited about the future. I'm a future person, so some of the changes that I see happening that technology has made possible just make me really excited. I do think that this is deeper into our cultural need, and I don't know, but I want to think about it and talk about it with others. On an individual level, of course, we start with our own families and our own friends, and I think there's a real magic in helping a child, yours or other people's children, learn how to create something that's concrete, to understand the concrete. But um, I don't know what the answer is going to be broadly. And I really hope that I can be in a circle of people talking about this in the very near future, thinking it through in terms of how do we actually start designing systems, structures, ways of thinking that encourage people. I'm not a person to force anyone to think a certain way or live a certain way, but I think context really matters. So how can we create contexts for these conversations? And is it meaningful to someone who lives across the country from me, who's in a big city, who's in a really bad spot right now? What does that mean for his life or her life? I have a lot to learn in that area, and I'm really hungry to get after it.
You said you were a principal.
Very short time.
How did that come about, and why was it short?
Well, it actually, by that time, I'd moved to a private school, and the principal there had a personal family crisis, and so I took the interim spot and then filled it out the next year. I am not a manager of parts. I like leaders. I like ideas. I like systems that you can hang those ideas on that work for the people in the system. And I just shuffled so stinking much paper, and my counterparts in the public schools had it worse. so much paper shuffling, so many legal restrictions. You end up getting somebody. When I was at the private school, for example, I had grandmas and grandpas coming in to help some of my kids who managed to get to 9th or 10th grade without really knowing how to read. And so, I'd interview volunteers to come in and help. And some of the kids who had kinesthetic ability and who had really hard time sitting in a chair for more than an hour or so, we had a spot where they could work on small engines and apply their learning. And all that became a legal issue. Oh, the insurance company doesn't want us to do this. It just got wearisome. And I have a lot of respect for good principals. That is almost a thankless job. And a good principal has to shepherd structures and systems and people and all kinds of stuff. It was more like a truant officer position for most of my friends. And I just was like, nah, not for me.
So how do you move from there to eventually you co-founded the Freedom Foundation? So talk to me about that process and what the Freedom Foundation was and is.
Well, I got pretty good at politics, at figuring out how to persuade a certain number of people that my candidate was worth supporting. But it was a means to an end for me, because the policy is what drove me. I mean, to me, the political realm was the mechanism one had to use to elect someone to office who might then be mindful of these issues of freedom and opportunity that mattered so much to me, especially in education. So I got pretty good at it, but it just wasn't meaningful. And so when I ran a campaign for someone who was a severe underdog and ended up beating the odds, once again, because we looked at the people first, at the leverage first, at where he needed votes, and just went after it. A very honest, upfront persuasion campaign, and I watched hearts and minds change in that process. And but it was the policy that really mattered to me, and so he and I had an agreement. If he didn't win the final the general election, that we would start an institute based on ideas for real people. And so he didn't. He lost the general election, and so we started a foundation. And he had name-wide recognition in the state I lived in, and so we launched this world of ideas, and we hit the public sector unions head on early. So that changed a lot of things for me personally.
So to take a step back, and then I want to come back to that, because obviously coming up through education as a teacher, you got to see that universe in a very particular way. You alluded to this, but talk about your political philosophy, sort of your ideology, if you will, because it obviously, you alluded to going through a bit of a transformation, and it sounds like by the time you start this think tank, this foundation, you've already got some pretty strong principles there. So tell me your sort of ideological journey.
Yeah, it happened relatively quickly. I was in my 20s, and my father-in-law at that time stood up to some things that he in his lifetime never thought he'd have to stand up to. And he wasn't particularly a political person. I watched him and listened to him and learned from him why it was dangerous to give Congress, for example, so much power over an individual sitting in their home or their business in our state. And again, he wasn't a flamboyant political kind of figure like we think of some. He was a pastor, and we think of today some pastors on television, all that. He was a very quiet, hardworking man who actually did not like the spotlight. But I watched him in 2 cases stand up for injustice. And I learned a lot. I began to read and study what's the effect of of government. Why was government created? And what happens when government grows beyond the boundaries? And how, government has, a lot of people have good intentions. They want government to fix these things. Does that actually work? If I said, okay, Congress should define what acceptable religious boundaries are. Congress should decide whether or not someone can homeschool their child. Does it work? So I actually came into it with a very open mind. I really didn't know.
Were you, so it sounds like you weren't necessarily particularly political.
Not at all. Not at all. No, I just didn't have any. My parents were, they would call themselves now, and I would call them now, progressives. And that was the literature and things we had in our home. But we were taught to be curious and to explore. And so when I did dive to that first and then second layer and then eventually third layer, I started to see the genius of the structure of our country and why certain things were put together now hundreds of years ago and how they're based on human nature. And so when people we're saying, well, yes, but that was, our founders did this hundreds of years ago. We've progressed. Yes, we've become more uncivil. We're more warlike. What is it? What's this progression? What are the safety nets they built in, and do they really still matter today? And I really ended up coming to the conclusion that it was based on human nature, the best and worst of human nature, which really doesn't change much in terms of basic things. And so we have competitive needs, we have security needs, we like power. There are all kinds of things that are the same for humans 1,000 years ago as today. And so I began to have a deep respect for the actual American governance structure as I studied it. And you couldn't have told me that I didn't care at all, and nor did I actually agree with most of what I think today in those early days.
And then, so was there anything that you had read that, for me, Hayek was this Hayek, and Hayek also kind of derivative Hayek through the work of people like Russ was this eye-opening thing. I mean, it's so, that's why our company is called Emergent Order, because it's so fundamental to the way I understand the way the world works. Did you have something like that? Something that took it to that next level, brought you deeper? Did you have a book or a thinker that took you down the rabbit hole?
Well, it was Hayek, but it was a little later. I ran into my economics professor at a coffee shop in Ashland, Oregon, where I'd been at school, and I'd already, gotten out, and I had just read Hayek, and I sat down with him and said, "How come we didn't learn anything about Hayek? How come?" I was starting to ask deep questions about capitalism. There were always adjectives attached to capitalism, and yet it seemed to me like it was a system that came out of just a human discovery process. How come we didn't talk about that? I was asking him about this. By then, I'd started to understand the tools of private property. What happens when an individual is protected to own and use something of value and to create value for others, both in their property and their person. And my father had talked about voluntary consent and many other kinds of structures or many other kinds of meanings, but not in this. So I began to ask him about this, annoyed him to no end, and he told me I should read Hayek. And so I had read a little, and so I jumped into the world of Hayek. And that really jarred my mind. It irretrievably jarred my mind. So I am grateful.
What was there something in particular that changed for you during that process, in terms of either the way you think not more broadly. I mean, very specifically. Like, so for example, when I got out of school, so I was raised in a pretty Catholic Italian family, so pretty conservative upbringing, and and when I got out of school, one of the things that I was struck by was this very strange nature of reality, which was the people's relationship with drugs. I happen to, for whatever reason, my dad's super, like he said, he would say three things to me every day while I was going to college. He said, don't do drugs, don't get AIDS, don't get anybody pregnant. If you do those three, don't do those things, I'm sure you'll be fine. He never asked me about my grades.
That's interesting.
All he said is, don't do those three things. Don't do drugs, don't get AIDS, don't get anybody pregnant, and you'll be fine. And so when I got out of school, and I wasn't especially I'm actually more rebellious now in a lot of ways than I was younger.
Yes.
I met people who had like done cocaine in high school, and it was mind-boggling, and they were functioning. They weren't like some image of some strung out disaster. And I didn't honestly, I didn't understand like how this was possible. And I asked them, like, where did you get it? And like, oh, it was actually easier to get cocaine in high school in Greenwich, Connecticut than it was to go get a beer. And so it was like this crack that led me to become much more of a classical liberal or libertarian, because it's like, well, wait a second. Well, drugs are illegal, but people still get them. And I said, well, didn't like the cops, like what happened, like were there ever like police? It's like, oh yeah, the cops would come and they would like tell you to quiet down. And then I learned that, like, well, if you're in Greenwich, Connecticut and you're having a high school party and there's drugs and alcohol, the cops will come and pat you on the head. If you're in Newark, New Jersey, it's a totally different ballgame altogether. And so the inequality of that and this whole sense of like something that is perhaps, let's just say it's like drugs aren't good for you. So whether it's moral or not, it's still not really a great idea. And so you would think, well, if the law is supposed to be in line with what's good and bad, well, then of course drugs should be illegal, right? But here we are with this strange set of unintended consequences that actually makes everything worse, with this sense of this prohibitionism. And that was like this doorway into this way of thinking, like, oh, wait a second. Just because I don't like something, or maybe that something actually is bad, it doesn't necessarily mean it should be illegal. And it doesn't, and if you make something illegal or ban it, you haven't necessarily gotten rid of it. And so how do we think about like what should government do in what domains, once you recognize that in reality, once you recognize that half of Americans smoke pot, even when it wasn't legal. And when they legalized it, like when they decriminalized drugs in Portugal, like drug use in high schools went down. And like so like that economic way of thinking is like the only access point into this, because the sort of simpleton storytelling that politicians do, like, I'm going to ban this and then it'll be gone. Like, I'm going to ban guns and they'll be gone like magic.
Yep.
Once you realize, well, that's nonsense. You're like, what tools do you have to try to understand how the hell does anything work? What was that like? Did you have that kind of moment with a particular thing, or was it broader for you as you were grappling with Hayek and like this experience in education?
It was a confluence of things. As I was doing that grappling, which agitated me permanently and, like I said, irretrievably, I also was grappling with, did I even believe God existed? And if so, what did that mean? And my then father-in-law he would have just loved chatting with him. He pretty much, his definition of freedom is pretty much what my philosophy is today. But at that time, I didn't know. And he said, each person has to be free to do whatever they need to do that doesn't injure another person's right to have freedom themselves. And so it was a little less articulate than how some of our deep economic thinkers have expressed it, but it was the same kind of thing. And we talked about the law, how the law was designed to help check our base or lower instincts on those essential freedoms that we would cause another to lose, like in property or personal value, and that impulse to hurt others. And he was a believer that our society would be more peaceful and more civil if we had more freedom and fewer government intervention. And he wasn't like, I got to be careful here, he wasn't like this wild-eyed, come out of the mountains, tin hat kind of guy at all. He member of the Chamber of Commerce, was a quiet city leader, just a good, decent man who had run into his own life issues that he had to grapple with and figure out, what did he believe? And so this confluence of meeting him, knowing him and talking with him, of getting to know some of the thinkers of economic and political freedom, and just observing life and observing that despite all we want government to be able to do to fix things, it is ill-equipped to do so. Even if we want it to, it's ill-equipped to do so. I personally don't want it to do most of those things because it can't, but it's ill-equipped. So it was just this handful of like 3 to 4 years of enormous turmoil internally for me trying to figure this stuff out.
So when you go through this political period now, and so you've already at this point got this philosophical foundation that's taking shape, right? Mm-hmm. And you start the Freedom Foundation. Tell me, let's go back to basics on this. Like, what is a think tank, especially at the state level?
I didn't even know then. In fact, I remember going into a room with 13 think tank leaders, some of whom still today, who have helped change our world, our nation certainly. And I was the only non-academic, as it were, came out of a whole different sector, and as the only woman in the room at the time too, and scratching my head thinking, well, the only think tanks I knew about were the big ones. The big national think tanks have been around for a long time, like Brookings, and I didn't really know much about them, but I sure thought it sounded boring. And I am not a person who handles boredom well at all. So I told my co-founder at that time, Bob, I said, I'm not really interested in this because this sounds boring. And he said, I promise you, I'm going to introduce you to these people. You'll see it's not boring. Well, the Institute for Justice had started, and I got a chance to sit down and talk to Clint and Chip and Clint Bullock and Chip Miller and a few other folks who they were right. It's not boring. It's about people. It's about serving people, about helping create opportunity for the people I really want to serve. It's about creating a civil society. And but along the way, I discovered that was still a little bit of an anomaly for some think tanks. A longtime friend of mine had become the president at the State Policy Network, and this was after we'd already started our institute. It was a very different institute. We had 5,000 plus members, in quotes, all around the state, and very grassroots oriented, very community. Let's have conversations about this, and some policy, and some good policy, but not dozens of things. Like I said, we had run into the public sector union buzzsaw on almost every single thing we were trying to do. And it started with conversation, not even willing to have a conversation about how an alternative might look. What if we did this way? So I went through basically 8 years of what I never expected to do, which was litigate. Never expected to have to. That would be the last thing that I would have said I wanted to do. At some point, it became clear to me that I'd hired some incredibly talented people, most of whom are still in some place in this country serving this interest. I'd had the pleasure of learning how to build an institute. I didn't know anything about how do you build something? How do you start? Where do you start? What's a business plan for this? And how do you actually put pieces together? I'd gone to a couple private sector people, one gentleman who from Herman Miller Furniture, who graciously allowed me to sit at his feet for a better part of a week and learn how you run a company, how do you build one and run one. So even starting that was different than most institutes. It did not come out of a university. It did not come from academics. Bob had been a 10-year legislator, and he was ready to be done. And so we created this kind of unique vehicle. But at some point, it's like, well, I'm not a lawyer, and I want leverage really, really matters to me, leverage. So
you've said this a couple times now. When you say leverage, what do you mean?
So think about a flywheel. If you apply torque, the right amount of torque to the right spot, you create a disproportionate value or energy. And there are hundreds of things we can do every day in our lives. There are dozens of policies that we care about. There's always something that if you do it really well, it makes everything else easier or unnecessary. There's always something that provides disproportionate value in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives. And I don't want to spend time. I really have this thing. I want to invest it. And I just so for me, that really matters. So I realized it was time for me to move on. So I thought that I was going to go to a grant-making foundation, and I have an executive coach who I just adore. And he said, Lynn, you're not going to be excited there. You're going to be bored because you're going to be looking at other people's ideas, not your ideas. Well, so he was right. So then I thought, well, I think I'll start a business. And about that time, Tracy Sharp from the State Policy Network chatted with me and asked me if I'd come to work for State Policy Network and work with our leaders and try to find that leverage in leaders and raise the bar on what it meant to be a successful institute. And so together we've charted that course, and I have had the privilege of working alongside some of the finest people. I admire them greatly. And so that's my principal charge, is strategic positioning, looking down the road and around the corner, helping SPN do that and groups do that, but also this amazing gift of being able to find, nurture, and work alongside some of these great leaders and help them find their leverage.
I want to come back to the public sector buzzsaw. Because
yes.
if somebody's for people who are listening and aren't familiar with some of these issues, what is that all about? So obviously you were a teacher. Were you a member of a union when you were a teacher?
Actually, no, and it's one of the reasons I left the public school, because I probably would have stayed a little longer, but by then I was pretty agitated by the way they ill-served teachers, and by the actual the kinds of people who were drawn into a structure where you felt you needed that kind of protection. It didn't feel like a way to advance a professional career for me. That was a personal choice.
So, one of the things that doesn't get very much national conversation, if you're a politics junkie and you have your news feed set up for Politico and The Hill and NPR and all that, you're not really going to see a lot of talk about public sector union issues. They're very much a state issue, but it's something that once you try to think about how do you make changes happen in a state, it seems to become the number one issue. And I'll give you an example. I know you're well aware of, my own state of Pennsylvania. I live in Texas now, but I'm a Pennsylvanian. When I went to Penn State, the liquor store was actually a government-run liquor store. Yep. And when I think back to, I sort of took it for granted. I'm just like, oh, you had to drive to this post office-like building. It was very, it looked nothing like what you would, your typical pull up to a retail establishment with a brand and good customer service. It was like you were buying liquor in the Ukraine or something in
Yes.
1985.
Yes.
But that, I guess, was a thing that apparently, liquor sales, even though prohibition ended in the 30s, at the state level, there was still all these weird holdovers, and one of them in Pennsylvania was like state ownership of liquor stores or something like that. And you talk to almost anybody today, and it's like, well, that seems crazy. Why would the government run liquor stores? First of all, isn't liquor kind of bad? So why isn't it weird for the government to be selling liquor?
Mm-hmm.
The public health thing, that seems a little weird. And yet, my understanding is that the attempts to try to privatize alcohol sales in Pennsylvania run up against public unions because the workers are unionized, and and they don't want that change. They've got their contract; they're getting paid essentially by the taxpayer, and so they don't want that apple cart turned. They don't want that cheese moved, so to speak.
Yes.
And it seems like a lot of things at the state level, which doesn't capture the imagination like Medicare for all or any of these national issues, but in many cases impact you a lot more, like what you can do on your property and
Mm-hmm.
what your schools are like in your neighborhood. Almost all those issues seem to run up against this public sector union issue, and this sort of resistance to any form of change, because the deals that have been struck benefit the people who are already in the system, or at least that's an interpretation that I think is reasonable. What is that about? Like where, because I don't know that I'm certainly not like inherently anti-union, but there's something special
No.
about these organizations. Like break that down for me.
Well, let's just take that liquor store as an example, and then we'll move it straight into some of the most important issues we face today. The post-prohibition era, people were worried that if the government didn't get engaged in how liquor was distributed, that people would hurt themselves, that there would be harm to innocent folks. And this is one of those examples where the government moved into something that was well-intended. We're going to keep people from hurting each other. What they began to do is erode freedom. And this grew to magnitudes that are almost incomprehensible. So in most states, for a very long time, for decades, governments regulated the sales of liquor. And then when organizations became unionized, when these public sector workplaces became unionized, then their rights came into play. Who you could hire, who you could fire, your whole tenure things, pensions, insurance, all these programs began to build up. Well, 10 or 20 years of that, 40, 50 years of that, and you have an institution. It's like an iceberg. You only see what's out of the water. You don't see that great big base under the water that is full of maybe well-intended folks who put some laws together decades and decades ago that are outmoded, but they are now supported by this enormous structure of public sector unions and all of the entanglement of those protections in federal and state law, both federal and state law. This is what's happened to education. This is what's happened to healthcare. And so, and I hasten to add, I'm not opposed. I mean, I think we have to have public sector workers. And it used to be that they sacrificed political, or they sacrificed monetary extra gain for the security of that job. Things have changed a lot. And in many cases, in Washington State, for example, public sector workers are the highest paid group of workers in any county except for two. And that would be the one that King and Tacoma, the cities of, Seattle and Tacoma sit in. So am I opposed to public sector workers getting paid well? No. I'm just opposed to them getting paid under a structure that erodes the freedom for everybody else. Now, I have a whole family. My family, there are a lot of them or we would classify as public sector workers. They're fine people. They're good people. They worked hard. They work hard today. But it's in this structure again where government has decided that it's going to put and insulate entire parts of the economy and put them off limits to any kind of potential reform or change because somebody's job is going to be affected. Right now, the Department of Agriculture wants to move two Washington-based AG kind of designated organizations on research and development to Kansas City. There is a hue and cry. Why? Well, I don't blame people for not wanting to move if your family's in D.C. and your roots are there, but it's better for the rest of America to have more of these kinds of decisions made outside of Washington, D.C., to be making decisions in the heartland, to be rubbing shoulders with people who are the real folks who live all across this country than it is to sequester everything in D.C. Bottom line is a lot of decisions that affect our daily lives are made at state capitals, and they're protected by very strong government sector unions that are now usually the first, second, or third largest political contributors to any campaign.
I know that FDR and LaGuardia as mayor were both, as governor and mayor in New York, opposed to public sector unionization.
Yes.
Even though obviously FDR passed the Wagner Act, so he was hardly opposed to unionization in general, on the basis that it is essentially, this is a strong term, but it's essentially corrupt because of that what you just said. So, if I work for the United Auto Workers Union in Detroit, and I'm representing workers on the line, and I go to a negotiation about benefits or work hours or work conditions or whatever with management at Ford Motor Company, we are on two opposite sides of the negotiating table. Ford, obviously, they want people to be productive. They want to. They have shareholders, and most important of all, which is always forgotten, they're customers. The customer is the ultimate boss of every company. It's not the shareholders; it's the customers.
But it's not in education or healthcare anymore.
Well, and it's but that interaction is actually contentious, and they are serving different interests. There is not a conflict of interest. A conflict of interest is where you're sort of standing on both sides of the table. And so, there's a give and take there. And at the end of the day, it's still fundamentally voluntary, because the money that, if Ford says, okay, we're going to raise wages to X, or we're going to change this benefit Y, or we're going to increase the pension contributions, or that's coming out of money that is and funds that are under the control of Ford.
That's right.
When you make that a public sector union, however, it's totally different, because for one thing, the United Auto Workers Union really can't run a campaign to get the CEO of Ford elected. So there is no way. So they really are at odds in a good sense. But I remember when I was living in New Jersey, John Corzine was running for re-election, and he was standing in front of a crowd of workers and union activists, and he said, "I'm with you." So that would be like the CEO of Ford being in front of the United Auto Workers Unions, or the AFL-CIO, and saying, "I'm with you guys." Like, it doesn't even make any sense. And the person that's not at the table in the public sector is the taxpayer who's actually footing the bill.
That's right.
So if I'm a public sector union, I can come to the table at the State House, talk to a legislator or even the governor across the table, and say, well, I am the single biggest contributor to your campaign, so you're going to do this, this, and that, or I really strongly recommend you do. And it's the money that's going to pay for that is not coming from that person. It's coming from the taxpayer, who's not at the table at all. And so, even FDR saw that as being fundamentally corrupt. It's the definition of corruption.
But people don't see it that way, John. And my mom retired as her public sector teacher union representative. We had this conversation. It's like, well, Mom, you all these teachers pay dues, and in her association, it was about $1,000 a month, or I mean a year, that they paid. You don't know where that money goes exactly, but you know that a bunch of it goes to politicians, and most of them are usually on one side of the political sphere. And there's no conversation about this. So, Mom, how do you feel? I mean, as we had this, it was interesting because she negotiated for her union, for her teachers, and it was very local, so she wasn't thinking about it from a bigger picture, but most of the dues get sent up the line, and then it goes into the state and goes into the federal, and that makes them one of the largest political contributors in the country and in almost every state. And so just as you said, then that money gets put into the campaign coffers of politicians who say, yes, we will continue to support your union, strengthen what you want, we'll serve your interests. And if people don't think that's happening, I'm sorry, it happens. It happens all the time, over and over and over in this country every day. It's the reason that people on both sides of the political aisle who are thoughtful about wanting education reform and wanting healthcare reform, neither side of this equation can get through with those ideas because they have to pass the phalanx of these very well-paid union representatives. And very rarely does the average person who pays the dues have any say whatsoever in that decision. Furthermore, most of the people who run these unions have been running them for decades and unelected by most of the people who are currently in the unions. So almost no teacher in a classroom today, almost no hospital worker, almost no person at the Department of Agriculture who is a union member has voted for the person who actually runs that union. And they don't get an accounting of where that money goes. So their voices are tamped down. I mean, we did a Supreme Court case on this and thankfully won it. But where does the voice of the union itself trump the free speech rights and choices of its members? And our state court at that time said yes. So we took it to the Supreme Court. Thankfully, they took it, and the Supreme Court said no. But in function, that's what happens. And if you're a teacher and you don't join the union, or you leave the union, first of all, it's really hard to leave the union, really hard. And you still have to pay a lot of your dues because of various free rider issues. And you don't know where the money's going, and you no longer get some of the information in the teacher's lounge you used to get. It is very hard and lonely to be the handful of people who say no. And so we have to change this. I'm not the unions. If we didn't have private sector unions, we would not have some of the changes that are absolutely critical in the workplace today. So I'm not making the argument that private sector unions should go away. I don't like some of the things they do, but look, they can compete, create the conflict, and lean into it like everybody else. But in the public sector, it's taxpayer money being funneled through an institution that then funnels it back to politicians who then make the decisions that we all live with. That's just wrong. And I didn't get that. I didn't understand that at all going into these in my early years. I just thought for sure if we brought people with sound ideas from different political perspectives together, that we could get some changes done, some reforms done. And this buzzsaw is that the unions, first of all, said no, because even if it wasn't their direct piece of the pie being affected, they were allies with another one of, I call them the acronyms that hover around the state capitol, the acronyms who were maybe being threatened. And so they stuck together like this little cabal, and reasoned people couldn't get through. And that is still the case today, although some Supreme Court cases have made this legally more we're able to do it. It's still really hard. So we want to reform education. We actually want a healthcare system that provides high quality, affordable care to everybody who can access. Access and affordability, which is what we say we want. We want a system that works for all children to be able to access it. We're going about it backwards, and we have to change this.
Education and healthcare are the two of the issues I care about the most. Which is not that surprising because my mother was a teacher and my dad's a doctor. Although I've
Mm-hmm.
never quite thought of it exactly like that, but it is true. Um, and it's like nobody actually seems to know about some of the most crazy sounding laws that have a huge impact on people. So one
Yeah.
example, and in so many ways, I've learned about these things through the work that we've done together. So
Yes.
one of them, and it goes along very similar lines, is it's called Certificate of Need. It's like the most
Mm-hmm.
boring. These things are almost intentionally made to be boring and sound dry and innocuous, so that they can't be salient for anybody. But if you've never heard of Certificate of Need, it's a permission slip that you as a provider of healthcare services have to get by law in order to provide the service. So, for an example being, we're here in Austin, Texas. You want to open up an inexpensive, sort of modern retail MRI and sort of body scans plus. You want to just call it body scans plus, and you can come in here,
Mm-hmm.
pay cash, maybe they'll even take insurance, but if you don't have to have all the nonsense of trying to get paid by insurance companies, you can have. There's a lot of costs go away. It's a lot cheaper just to do cash. Say, okay, cash, $100 for an MRI. You have to go and get a permission slip called a certificate of need to have those MRI machines. And the people responsible for saying yes sit on the boards, are involved in
That's
the
right.
existing hospitals that currently provide
Yes.
MRIs.
That's right.
So what do you think they're going to say when you need to get their permission to compete with them with lower cost?
That's right.
Nobody ever
And
talks about this. It's always about paying for stuff. Everything about
mhm.
all of these issues, whether it's education or healthcare, the public debate is always, how are we going to pay for it? As if the costs are like some fixed and they dropped down from the sky, and it just costs. There's a mysterious cost that happens, and it's going up for reasons we don't understand. It's like, well, you're making it go up because you're not letting more people provide the service and compete.
That's right. Yes. And it's fascinating that things like cosmetic surgery have dropped in price because of the competition. And it's fascinating. And now that doesn't mean everybody who does cosmetic surgery ought to be doing it. So, I mean, I'm not, again, not suggesting we don't have to have any kinds of structure or laws. The issue is the certificate of need is a barrier, an unnecessary and very high barrier to entry in almost every field. That with regulatory issues, occupational licensing, where, if I want to open a school in my state, it's pretty darn hard for a whole bunch of reasons that have nothing to do with education. If I want to open a body tattoo, it's actually pretty ironically difficult to do that for reasons that have nothing to do with public health and safety. And a lot of it has to do with the people who decide whether or not you can compete with them or not. They sit on boards and decide. And it's just wrong. And honestly, I don't expect most people to wake up in the morning and think about all this stuff. Our lives are full of deep things. I just found out today that a very dear friend of mine, a young mother, a young wife, has pretty bad cancer. That started my day with, gee whiz, my problems are small compared to this. So our lives are full of these things, but a handful of people have to be thinking about this. We have to be at some level engaged to the end, with the end in mind, being opportunity for more people. But underneath all this, John, we're yelling at each other in this country. We are speaking about each other in ways that are reprehensible. And we are not going to have a more peaceful society if we don't allow more freedom, more genuine diverse conversations, and ability for people to both succeed and fail. We're just not going to have it. So for that reason alone, I want human freedom to expand.
What do you make of what has been, these sort of technical state issues that we've been talking about the the dynamics of the public sector unions or or these various restrictions and licensing things, they all represent the issues that these state-based organizations, these policy and advocacy organizations that you help support and help to make more effective, to you know, that's what they're doing. That's what
Yeah.
the state policy network exists to do, right? What have you observed about this discourse at the state level? Because the national level is just a cesspool of punishing despair and a vortex to hell. It's like, okay, so you're either a white supremacist Nazi or a communist. And
Yes.
there's not really any way to get in between those two, or something. It's just toxic. It seems like the more local you get, the less toxic it gets. Has that been your experience?
It has been until recently. It is now changing locally as well in many places, sadly. And part of this is because we have big ideological machinery, well-funded machinery moving into states, particularly states that have an initiative and referenda process, and the vitriol is being turned up. And I'm going to say it's not a one-sided issue. It's not just Republicans yelling at Democrats and Democrats yelling at Republicans. It's this basic avoidance of our responsibility to allow genuine diversity, genuine discourse, difference of opinion, and treat each other civilly. It's really a very fundamentally human thing we're going to have to call out in each other. So these institutes, talk about leverage. This is one of the reasons that I said yes to Tracy. Because most of us don't get up and think about all this every day. We just don't. Some people have to. So the beauty of a very independent, broad network of thinkers and doers work together collaboratively, but also they're all independent. There's no mothership. There's no centralized authority. They are working to build durable freedom infrastructures in their states. And this is really quite remarkable because while we are very different people, in fact, it's fun to be in a room with a lot of these folks because we disagree on all kinds of things, but we agree on the core, which is that every human being deserves freedom, deserves opportunity. And the American structure that was designed to create that, while not perfect, is about as good as it's going to get to make that real. So we have vociferous disagreements on all kinds of things, but we agree on that. And so this wonderful independent network of deep thinkers and people who want action for all the right reasons, those are the people it's my privilege to serve and work with. And it's the battles are getting actually more challenging as the vitriol is turned up in many state capitals. But it's worth the battle. The end result is worth the battle. And I've maybe said this several times. I think you have to do something with the end in mind. Where are we going here? What do we want? How do we create this? So it's just a privilege to work with these entrepreneurial leaders, no franchisees. They're all independent actors who collaborate together to try to build some kind of a structure that will help with this human opportunity.
One of the things, you're saying that most people aren't going to be thinking about these, but somebody has to. It's amazing how much everything works that way, right? So when you think about any business or but let's think about retail for a second. Most people go into a store. Obviously, everybody's concerned about price and quality, but most people will go into a store like a Target or a Walmart or whatever. And they're going in. They need to get what they're going to get. They pick it up and head out the door. And then and I wouldn't be surprised if there's almost a kind of anthropological number to this. It's somewhere between probably 5 and 15% who are the super shoppers. Who
Yeah, it's single digits.
it might even be below 5%.
Yeah.
And you would think on paper, well, they have no impact at all, and that's why, competition doesn't work that great because most people don't really care. But the funny thing about, like, the thing that I think is often forgotten about competition is you just don't need that many conscious shoppers for a company to take notice. I'll give a great
Yes.
example from that I only even know about because of the work I did with Lisa on At the Fork about animal welfare issues. McDonald's changed all of their egg suppliers because less than 5% of their to go to cage free, because basically caged eggs are
Right.
in a kind of heinous concentration camp. If you get the cheapest eggs you can buy, they're produced in a facility where the chickens live in cages the size of a sheet of paper for their entire short life, and you would not want to buy it if you went to the place and looked at it. Almost nobody would find it acceptable. Like, they wouldn't go from, oh, I'll take those eggs. And yet that's the way it is for a lot of reasons. It was something like less than 5% of McDonald's customers were expressing concern about the caged eggs. They changed it for everybody.
Yes.
Because if you lose 5% of your customers in your McDonald's, you're out of business. Their profit margins aren't that high. And so this is that leverage that you were talking about. You don't need that many people to become engaged in an issue, at least in a competitive market sense, for there to be pretty radical change. I mean, I think it's even true in the political sense, right? I mean, what percentage of American colonists were actively agitating for revolution? It's less than a third of the population.
Single digits.
It's obviously a tiny number of people, but they made the single greatest transformation, in a sense, the single biggest political act in human history. I would say, because I think America's pretty awesome and pretty important to the trajectory of humanity. And it was a very small group of people.
Yes. That's right. And it's always been that way. Our founding, grocery stores operate on very small profit margins. So the fact that single digit numbers, a number of people clip coupons and go from store to store, help people like me who now get better deals because I can go into a store and get a better prices. 20, 30 years ago, when I was choosing organic and humanely produced meat, and was an entire outlier, and had to pay all kinds of more money for these products for myself and my children. The fact that, again, a handful of people created the change that allows me to walk into any store now and have a selection of products that meet my needs at a decent price. This is how it works. There is an anthropological connection here. And so for people who are, tuning in and listening, each one of us needs to steward something like that in our life. And it will be different for all of us. But whatever we're called to steward, it's something that our engagement will disproportionately affect large numbers of people, for ill or good. I want to make it good. And I really, that is a passion in my life, with my family, with myself, with the people I know. Let's take this brief time we have here, and whatever issue or person or human cause that we have, steward it, do it, get engaged. And I happen to think that we're able to do that because of the marvel of our American system. And so I'm going to support that. Even though I know there are things that have to be changed, and I'll always want to fight for those changes, I'm always going to want to support the underpinnings that have given us the ability to steward those talents for the good of a lot of people.
Because of the issues, because of the nature of them, and for reasons that in some respects are I don't know how best to think about them, whether they're just historical or what. These free enterprise sort of bottom up individualist sort of approaches tend to be seen as being on the political right,
Mm-hmm.
and a larger role for government and for politics, and I think people would prefer to say a larger role for democracy, but democracy is politics. Tends to be on the political left, and that didn't. And the party alignment wasn't always that way. So the
That's right.
parties have sort of changed on a whole host of things. But how? Let's do an exercise in empathy. Where do you think people who you see as being on the other side of the issues that you care about, what is driving them? How did they? Because I think everybody, I mean, heck, even Hitler in his own perverse way thought he was going to make the world a better place. I think every human
Right.
being at some level, nobody's twirling a mustache saying, I'm going to do evil today. It's always,
Mm.
everybody thinks they have some rubric, some mental model, or some gut feeling about what it means to do good, and they think they want to believe they're going to do good. So for people that are, coming at these issues and seeing it differently, whether it's the teachers' unions or, the role of government in society in general, like, I feel like you're one of the most empathetic people I know in this universe. How do you think about what animates them and where there's maybe common ground or where there's opportunity to have that dialogue be talking at each other, with each other instead of at or past each other?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm related to a lot of folks. We don't agree on mechanisms, but we agree. Let's take healthcare. Chatting with a beloved family member about that recently. We both want people to have affordable, accessible healthcare. If it's affordable, it's likely to be more accessible. But even where it's not, make it accessible. We both want that for people. How do we get it? That's where the disagreement is. And if I thought that government, a bigger and ever expanding government, could create that kind of connection, we'd have a different conversation here today. But it doesn't. And so if we really want that, first of all, we have to understand what the other people want. And we have big assumptions that we think that we know what people want, and we don't. So we're wrong sometimes. So understand where people are coming from. What do people need? What do they want? Let's really lean in and understand. So I look at this in two kind of categories, and maybe this is simplistic, and maybe it's not even fair, but this is what I do. Most people in normal life, we can have this conversation. Where do we see these terrible rubs and these human tragedies that we want to solve? Where can we come to an agreement and really lean in and hear what the other people are saying? And then we can talk about the mechanisms to get there. And in human history, larger governments with expanded authority have, in fact, created the opposite effect for meeting most human needs. And so, that's a mechanism issue that we're going to have to we discuss. And there's a lot of room there for discussion. And I'm finding a lot of openness to talk about how we do something instead of whether we do it. It's how we do it, how it happens.
Yeah, one.
Um,
I mean, can
Go
you
ahead.
give me like a tangible example of some?
Yeah.
Because I think at some,
Yeah.
yeah,
Healthcare.
like going like one level deeper, like because obviously like there's an
Yes.
easy answer somebody gave is, look, well, this is a case where we need perhaps more or different, but likely kind of more than we have in the U.S. And look at Sweden or any of the other single payer systems around Western Europe. Like that's not a
Well,
totalitarian hellscape, right? I
except they're an incredibly homogenous population that is now starting to suffer greatly because of what they've built into the system that is in some cases no longer affordable. But put that aside. This beloved family member needs some alternative kinds of care. She needs to be able to have a few other healthcare practitioners look at her as a 360-degree, person, as a whole person, and work with her healthcare providers on some care. And she's run into, again, this buzzsaw of occupational licensing, regulatory reform, people not giving permissions to folks who have decades of, experience in taking a look at certain conditions from a different point of view. She needs to be able to have the ability to go see those people. She's not even asking her insurance to pay for it. She has to go out of state. In one case, she has to go out of country. And these aren't really weird, radical kinds of things. These are just things that we have not agreed yet because of all of the different interests at the table, that she doesn't have the right to go see these different healthcare practitioners. And so we had this conversation. But Lynn, they've been doing 20 years of this research on veterans, and we know it works on veterans, and we don't see any side effects. Why can't I get it? That's exactly right. Why can't you? And so that's a practical example. And I have a teacher friend who thinks that the curriculum that they're using for economics is pretty much a waste of time. And since I know something about this particular curriculum, I would agree. It's a pretty bad waste of time. She has several other well-proven economic curricula models that she would like to plug in. Well, it has to go through this various committee. It has to get approved by these various people, and it has to go through the State Board of Education. And if they don't approve it, it's not going to happen in her local school. This is not rational. This is not what reasonable people do. And so if we're going to solve some of these problems, we're going to have to hear each other. What do we really need and want? And work together. And it's not going to be a perfect solution. Nobody's ever going to get everything they want. I'm not going to get everything I want. I'm not going to get every law overturned or every regulation undone that I want. But we have to start. And proof's in the pudding. Then there's this other group of people who are, I guess that I don't really know how to categorize them politely, but they are political animals who are looking at their best election interests. And some of that's just human nature. I mean, who won a Nobel Prize for the public choice theory? I think that was Buchanan.
Buchanan.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just human nature, which is partly why our founders protected us by trying to have individual rights protected and as local a government as possible, and strong states that actually have more power than the federal government, that even give the federal government the right to exist. That's why they did it, because they know that at the core, we humans will abuse power too often. And so, we do have people in elected positions, and some of them are appointed positions. Some of the worst kind of issues to deal with happen at the county and local level, where you're trying to figure out how some kind of zoning issue, and you just run into deafness. Nobody wants to talk about it. They don't need to. It's not their job. Their job is to make the laws, enforce the laws, not to talk about them. And so there are people who, in their own self-interest, will not have these discussions. And so we have to, what's the workaround? And I spend some time in the strategy hat part of my work, is thinking, okay, we see the lay of the land. We see the position that these people are taking in this landscape. We now need an alternative. What is that?
In our last bit of time, I want to hone in on a word that we've used a lot, that you've used a lot, and that was part of your organization's name, freedom. How do you define freedom? You gave a definition earlier from your father-in-law, but how do you think about freedom? What does freedom mean to you?
Well, I'm not sure, again, that this is the perfect academic answer, but it is very similar to that an individual has the right to own and use something of value, their property and their person, as they see fit, as long as they don't erode the right of another person to do the same. I'm a big fan of voluntary consent. I've grown to love that phrase and wonder with great curiosity why It has not become part of our conversation in this country. And so at a very, very basic level, that's what freedom is to me.
I think that's such a perfect way to frame it, because in so many respects, when you look at the efforts by people to get legislation involved in some area, they almost always involve essentially banning otherwise consensual adult relationships in one way or another. It might be, you know, in the case of Jim Crow laws, it's obviously prohibitions against what, adults can do be based on race. But in so many other respects, and we tend not to think about it in these terms, it doesn't get talked about in these terms. These quote regulations are often just a ban on a voluntary choice, a voluntary contract, even if it's not written, even if it's just a handshake. Like, oh, I'll do this for you, you do this for me, and we're both, yeah, that sounds good. Oh, it's illegal.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's never framed that way. And I think that the challenge to it that I want to try to take seriously is this notion of power. And I feel like that is if there's two concepts that sort of define the modern, again, I hate to put it in these terms, but I'm going to say you could say right and left. I consider myself to very much be a liberal, classical liberal, but I think that's part of the core of liberalism. But the ideological spectrum, however you want to label it, one side is talking about freedom, and the other side is talking about power, and saying, and I think freedom comes in on both sides, right? Because you say, okay, well, that's great. Your definition of freedom is wonderful, but what if you don't have property? What if you don't have resources? What if the way people in general use the word freedom crosses the spectrum, right? So someone says, I don't feel that I am free to quit my job, because if I quit my job, I'll lose my health insurance, and my kid has a leukemia, and that, if I have to change insurances, that'll be a problem, or whatever.
Or I can't cross the state line and keep my insurance.
Yeah, any number of things. But at some level, and forget the policy part of that, but just like, or just I'm born into this neighborhood and I don't have the freedom to walk down the street and feel safe. And there's a freedom. So like the definition that you laid out, which I think is a fantastic definition of freedom. It's the freedom it's in a way, it's the freedom to do what you want, but also the freedom from having other people encroach on that, so long as you don't do the same. But there's also this sense of freedom from circumstances that don't feel necessarily the direct result of one individual. Like, again, like if you're born into poverty, you want to escape it. There's a freedom that comes with having resources, a freedom to make choices, a freedom to do certain things. And it's in our language. We talk about it that way. How do you respond to people, and how do you think about this broader conception of freedom that is that includes the freedom, the freedom to tackle things in a way that requires resources to do that?
So any political party, any group of people who cannot succeed without making victims should be ashamed of themselves. If we can look at human beings as full of opportunity, no matter where they are, and we have generations of stories of people who have come from gross neglect, great poverty, situations that could have crushed them, and the difference in our country is supposed to be that we give people an equal playing field and a context in which they can create opportunity for themselves. It's not a fixed pie. It's not like if you don't have some now, you're never going to have any. Not true. I was just remembering the other day that Peter Drucker, who's a genius, in my opinion, was most prolific between 60 and 92 when he died. And it made me realize that sometimes people in life think about their current situation and they say, this is my life, this is where I am. And some political parties and some political movements and factions, that they encourage that. They look at people as victims. And that's not how this country ever was created to view human beings. Except, I will tell you, the scourge of slavery in our country is something that the effects of that we will deal with for a very long time. And that's for another conversation. So I'm going to say, I want to put a pin in it, that I think that part of our nation's history is grievous and we have to address it. But that said, our modern day thinking should be that every human being has equal opportunity and an equal opportunity to succeed. And we are at our best when we are helping other people do that, when we are creating jobs. Good friend in Georgia whose institute is working to create jobs for people who have been incarcerated, because they know, research shows that if you have a job when you get out of jail and you have a family to go back to, that you are far less likely to reoffend. So they're working directly with people to help direct service providers to create jobs. There are all kinds of ways that we humans in this country create opportunity for others. And we are best served. This unique thing about capitalism is we prosper most when we are helping others prosper. And it's not universally 100% true. It is just, as a principle, that is generally what happens. We prosper most when we help others. So unleash the job creators. Help the people who've made a mistake to find another way in life. Help those who have had tragedy see themselves as a human being full of opportunity, not as a victim, not as someone who has to have a political solution, not as someone who has to have elected officials come and champion in front of you and say how sorry they are about your life and that you're not going to have a future if they don't rescue you. This is a very bad way to look at another human being. So, yeah, sometimes we need a rescue. We often need a hand. There are situations in life where having something there to catch us when we're about to crash and burn is useful and helpful and life-changing. But we're going to have more of that if we start looking at human beings as equal partners in this life. We're in this together. We all have opportunity, and we stop looking at each other as victims or cash cows or in any sense, in any way, to be abused.
Well, Lynn, I think that's a great place for us to end our conversation. It's there's nothing that is more inspiring than thinking about human potential, and that's what you're talking about. And thank you for sharing this time together, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Well, John, I appreciate it, and you're an example of a motto I have, which is to go ahead and live that best life and start today. And you do that every day, and you've helped many of us to tell our stories and to tell the stories of the people we care about deeply. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.